Welcome back to Hardball. Earlier today, Attorney General Eric Holder, while addressing controversial state voter ID laws emerging across the country, took time to honor the generations of Americans who fought for voting rights in the first place. Let's watch the Attorney General.
I would argue that of all the freedoms that we enjoy today, none is more important or more sacred than the right to vote. Now, our efforts honor the generations who have taken extraordinary risks and willingly confronted hatred, bias, and ignorance, as well as billy clubs and fire hoses, bullets, and bombs to ensure that their children and all citizens would have the chance to participate in the work of their government. Without those people, there would be no Eric Holder. There would be no Barack Obama. And we must never forget that.
One of the heroes that the Attorney General mentioned is my next guest, an icon of the civil rights movement, U.S. Congressman John Lewis, Democrat of Georgia. He has authored a great new book, Across That Bridge, Life Lessons and a Vision for Change. Welcome, Congressman. I want to quote something from your book. It's about the Voting Rights Act. It's under attack even now in 2012. You argue, quote, that is why it is very important to remain engaged, especially when it is aggravating the vote. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have to make change in a democratic society, but one vote will not make all the change that is necessary. Change requires patient, persistent action. So tell me, speak now to the young people out there as well as the older people. Why is this issue of voting rights and what you achieved back in 65 important today?
Well, Chris, thank you so much for having me. I truly believe, I really do, in my heart, in my gut, that the vote is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. We must use it or we will lose it. It doesn't matter whether you're low income, whether you're middle income, or whether you're a billionaire. We all have one vote, and every single vote must be counted. So it's important that people go out, register, and vote like we never voted before. I think, Chris, there's a deliberate, systematic attempt to win or steal this election before it takes place. With the voter ID, in and early voting, making it almost impossible for young people, for students, for our seniors, for minority to participate, for the disabled to participate, is a sin. It's obscene to tell people that it's going to be hard, it's going to be tough for you to cast a vote. That's not right, it's not fair, and it's not just.
Mr. Lewis, I hear every word you say, and I'm worried about this. I'm going to talk about at the end of the show. I'm up here in Pennsylvania, which has just passed a law. It's been signed by the Republican governor, passed by a Republican legislature that says you need a government-issued photo ID card. If you don't have one on Election Day this year and you cast a vote, all you get is a provisional vote that doesn't become a real vote unless you within 6 days show up with a government-issued ID card, photo ID card. What are people who want to have everybody vote going to be able to do about these laws that have already been put in the books?
Well, I'm very worried also, Chris. That's why a group of my colleagues, more than 130 members of the Democratic House, have introduced a piece of legislation. It probably will not get passed in this Congress, but we want people to use it, to organize, to mobilize, and when we take back the majority, we will pass a voter act that would improve the Voting Rights Act of 1965. People cannot use an excuse of not having a voter ID. In some communities all across America, churches are providing people with a voter ID. But a voter ID is almost like a poll tax. It's the form of a literacy test, saying to people, like in the state of Texas, even a student ID cannot qualify. But a gun permit ID will qualify. That is obscene.
Well, what happens if this November we get up Wednesday morning, Congressman, and we realize that a state like Pennsylvania has gone for Romney, not because most people wanted Romney over Obama in Pennsylvania, but that most people, or a lot of people, weren't allowed to vote because they live in row houses, they don't own an automobile, like my grandparents were like that, and the neighborhoods are now African-American, the same row houses. These people are older, they're city people, they use the subway, they use mass transportation, they don't own cars, they don't have driver's licenses, and by the way, once you're 75 75 or 85 years old, you don't want to be driving a car. So the question is, how do they get voter ID cards with their picture on it?
Well, I think right now, not waiting until October or November, but the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and different voter groups must go into court and get an injunction against these states, county government for using this form to try to discourage people from participating. To be able to cast a vote should be very simple, like getting a glass of fresh water.
Yeah, I agree with you. Same-day registration to be fine with me. Hey, thank you. And once again, here's your book, Across the Bridge. How can I say across the river? Across the Bridge, your great history of civil rights and your involvement in it. It's an honor to have you on, Congressman John Lewis of Georgia.
Well, thank you very much.
Joe Williams, by the way, is a White House reporter for Politico. Fill in some of the details here, if you can, after the congressman's done here. What is going to be done now in reality, not in theory or moral victories, but how are the people going to get to vote? Given all these laws, like in Georgia, passed in 2007, the Pennsylvania law just passed this year, that require these very onerous requirements to get to just simply vote.
It's interesting because it almost seems like when Barack Obama put his hand on the Bible in 2008, or 2009 rather, like the 60s all of a sudden evaporated. Yet they're going to take some tactics from the 60s and start educating people through mass drives, going into churches, getting pastors and parishioners to talk about this in church and with each other, with their neighbors. As you mentioned, go door to door, knocking on row houses to make sure everyone knows what the law is and that everyone is prepared to meet the law when the polls open in November.
I actually think it could be, you know, a surprisingly positive thing. And of course, it's done for all the wrong reasons, of course. But if this energizes the local political organizations and the committee people in big cities, actually get out there and go door to door and really work with the voters and make sure they get to the motor vehicles office and make sure they get that ID card. This could energize people as a positive. Maybe it is a bigger hurdle than they should have had to face under the law. It shouldn't be this complicated. But if they can get out there and pass this hurdle and do this work politically at the local level, you might be able to re-energize local politics in this country. Maybe.
Well, and that certainly might be a side effect. Whenever I hear John Lewis talk about these sorts of things, all I have are the images of the Pettus Bridge back then and the fact that the hurdle overcome then was so much higher. The hurdle here is still in place. I mean, we shouldn't have to have a hurdle in the first place, but since it's here, they're going to make sure everyone clears it, and that can be an energizing, sort of a catalytic effect to get people to the polls and to recognize how precious this right is to cast a ballot in a free and fair nation, and have other people in this nation who have died for that right, have that right be sustained through overcoming what certainly is an adversity-filled campaign.
Do you get a sense there might be a real effort here to drive down the minority vote? I mean, look at this effort, first of all. It's aimed at urban areas where people don't own cars, older people that live in row houses and rely on public transportation like subways, like Cleveland, or not, well, Philadelphia certainly, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, cities like that. Right. We have close state elections, but you have minority communities that are bunched together in cities. And then they go after the ministers to go after same-sex, to turn the church people against the Democrats. You do wonder about this thing, how this thing's working, to try to get down the natural, or expected, I should say, strong vote for the president in the black community. To be blunt about it.
And it's hard not to see some dots, and seeing dots is hard not to connect them, because you have not only the matter where a lot of these voting rights laws are being enacted, 34 states nationwide, but a lot of the more tightened ones, a lot of the stricter ones are happening in battleground states. Pennsylvania, where you are, Ohio, Wisconsin's got a voter ID law that a lot of people are challenging. And it looks like there's an effort to sort of place the thumb on the scale. You couple that with a lot of what has been talked about with defunding unions, those kinds of laws where people aren't getting the right to collective bargaining. Unions do what? They register people to vote. There's also been a crackdown on third-party organizations, League of Women Voters, NAACP, anybody who does active voter registration drives now has to overcome a second hurdle and make sure that their organization is strictly set up for a social program. So it's a lot of interesting things that are happening. It's hard not to see it when you take the big picture view here.
So well said. Thank you, Joe. By the way, the advice to